Uh, we're continuing to look at Mary, and as we look at Mary, as I've stressed from the outset, we need to recover Mary. We need to be speaking of the person Mary, the approximately 14-year-old girl who found herself, through no fault of her own, the servant of God, the chosen of God, a young teenage girl found to be pregnant with suspicious circumstances. And as I mentioned, it's important for us to humanize Mary. The more we elevate Mary, the more we transform Mary into some kind of other than human kind of character, the more we lose the impact of what really matters in the story of Mary. As I mentioned, we lose the impact of the fact that, first of all, the story isn't about Mary, it's not about Joseph, it's not about the Jews, it's not about the Gentiles. It's first and foremost a story about God. Every human being gave up any claim to God and the blessings of God when we violated our relationship with God in the Garden of Eden. And time and again, generation after generation, as you and I, in our turn, have shown God that we call Him Lord, but we don't serve Him like Lord. As we have done that, you and I also have given up any claim, any right, any expectation to God. And that really is the story of the Bible, and it's certainly the story of Christmas, and it's the story of Easter. And that is that it is God deciding from eternity to be our God. As I mentioned in the sermon when we looked at the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. It was a connecting to the Genesis account, to the creation of all that was. And the fact that John tells us that before anything was created, the Word was already with God, is that powerful indication that even in the moment that God was creating everything, God knew we would mess it up. God knew that we would abandon Him. And God did what was necessary to remain our God. So that whether we're talking about Mary, or we're talking about any other character in the Bible, or we're talking about you and me, we always need to begin with a moment, a place of abject and utter humility. We don't have the right to expect anything from God. And the fact that we do receive blessings and benefits from God is why we worship. It's why we turn around and say, "Thank you, Lord." Because though we do not deserve anything, we receive everything. The second part of the reason why we need to remember the story of Mary is, while it's not our story and it's God's story, in the humanity of Mary, we learn the price of obedience, the price of sacrifice, what it means sometimes when God comes into our lives. As we look at today's story, I want to begin with a funny moment from my life from about 19 years ago. 19 years ago, I had moved to do a church internship into Herkimer County, New York. It's where I met Michelle. I lived in a small town named Dallsville. About 12 miles down the road was her town, Little Falls, and down there was the county seat of Herkimer. And I had to pass through all of those places to get to work. So one day, and it's Holy Week, I'm driving back home, and I'm going through Herkimer, New York, and as I'm getting to the outskirts of New York, I see Jesus. I see a man on the side of the road who had long hair and a beard, and he had a big flowing white robe, and he was carrying a cross. And I didn't know, the Bible tells us we don't know the day or the hour of Jesus' return. I also didn't know he was going to return to Herkimer County, New York. But apparently he did. And so I'm looking, and here's Jesus. And he's about a half mile down the road. And the sign was about 45 miles. So I'm catching up to Jesus. But as I'm getting closer to Herkimer Jesus, I begin to have a few doubts that maybe this isn't the end of the world. Maybe this really isn't my Jesus. And so as I get closer to Herkimer Jesus, I see that his cross is not what I thought a Roman cross would be. You know, the images that we have of the big, solid pieces of wood were replaced, at least if this was Jesus, Jesus was crucified on a pair of planks, like 2x8s, just nailed together. I don't know how they would hold body weight, but this was the cross of Herkimer Jesus. And as I get closer, my doubts begin to grow. I mean, he had the hair. I mean, we've all seen the pictures in all of our churches of what Jesus is supposed to look like, and he got the part. I mean, he really earned the role. He had the hair, he had the beard, he had the robe. The cross was what kind of threw me off. And as I get closer to Herkimer Jesus, then he's exposed. I wanted to believe, but alas, my hopes were dashed. And what gave Herkimer County Jesus away in the end wasn't the plank cross that was suspect. It wasn't, the use of modern nails. That was suspect. But it was the fact that as he was looking like he was carrying his cross through Herkimer County, he had a wheel on the bottom of his cross. And as I was looking at preaching to you all today and talking about this passage about Marion, I remembered Herkimer Jesus. I remember Herkimer Jesus and him carrying his wooden cross with the wheel to help him out. Because I think that is how most of us look at the Christian life. When we look at the life that we've been called to, we either hear voices telling us that we're supposed to expect our best life now. We're supposed to expect that God is just waiting to be a cosmic slot machine, ready to dispense blessing to us at every moment. When we pray, God is ready to just gift us with whatever we want. But then there's some of us that say, well, maybe it's not that. Maybe God isn't Aladdin. Maybe God isn't some genie that's just there to serve us at our whim. But still, the idea is a balance, that God's going to bless us as well as just the fact that life is going to throw us some good days and some bad days. Most of us look at our own suffering like Herkimer Jesus. God's going to give us a burden that we have to carry, but hopefully there's going to be a training wheel attached to it. We might suffer, but we're not expecting that a good and holy God would have us really bear the weight of suffering, really carry a cross that doesn't have an aid attached to it, doesn't have a sort of an assist to kind of help guide us through that makes it easier to carry. And so most of us, and I'll tell you, 20 years of being a pastor, I've seen this. We expect some suffering in life, but when hard days come, most of us aren't prepared, and most of us don't expect it, and most of us get angry at God because we're not ready. We've never been told that this is possible. And so I want you to understand, when we look at Mary, not a woman born without the stain of sin, not a woman born in a unique set of circumstances unlike you and I. But when we're talking about a 14-year-old girl who has been arranged a marriage by her family, her father, to a man named Joseph, who was, most scholars tell us, probably at least double her age. She didn't have any choice, but in the midst of this betrothal, she is found to be with child in a world that is exceedingly cruel to anomalies, to unexpected surprises, to derivations from the rules. The story today, the angel Gabriel breaks into the world of Mary, a little girl that probably might, like most girls who are of marriageable age, understand that Mary was probably not terrified, probably nervous, but like so many other girls dreaming of their marriage, she would have been a normal Palestinian girl looking forward to this new life that was going to be put upon her. I mean, what we see in our modern eyes as really almost horrific, a 12 to 14-year-old girl engaged to a man that was probably 28 years old, give or take. How horrific is that? How illegal is that in our world? And yet, in Mary's world, whether she was Roman or Greek or whether she was Jewish, that was life. And so she would have had her hopes and her dreams. She would have had her expectations. This was her betrothal. Her getting married was a normal routine. It was an expectation in her day. This is what she was supposed to be. She was supposed to be a wife. She was supposed to be a mother. But not in this way. Not in this way, where in the middle of all of her excitement and all of this transition, the angel disrupts her life in a major and significant way. The angel comes to her and says, "You're blessed. God is with you. You will bear a child." And it's interesting here how this is constructed in the Greek. He says to her, "Greetings to you who are favored, that the Lord is with you." And it says in English, in our translation, that she was perplexed. And that's an interesting word, because perplexed is kind of like curious, wondering, not sure what's going on. But the context in the Greek is very different. It says really that she was greatly disturbed. It's important to understand. Imagine whether you're 14 or 94, that all of a sudden in the midst of your day, an angel Gabriel sits in front of you. Imagine the angel comes to you and you haven't been drinking, or you haven't been into any funny stuff. You're cold, stone cold sober, and here comes Gabriel. It would cause you to question a lot of things, I have a feeling. She is disturbed by the presence of this angel. And the angel goes on to tell her that she's going to be with child. And we're told here in three times, that she is a virgin. And she herself says that, "How can this be? Because I've never known a man." The ancient world is no different than the modern world. We might have better medical technology. We might have a full understanding of how reproduction works. But even in the ancient world, they knew as much as we knew that this doesn't happen. It's far more likely to be a bad attempted excuse of getting out of it than it is an actual good reason. Nobody today would believe a virgin birth, and nobody 2,000 years ago would believe a virgin birth. Which is certainly why in Luke's gospel the angel Gabriel comes to Mary. And in Matthew's gospel the angel Gabriel comes to Joseph. Both Joseph and Mary receive an extraordinary guest, an extraordinary messenger with an extraordinary message. Because at least the two key players in this situation, Mary, who had no control over her destiny, and Joseph, who had utter control over Mary's destiny, both of them receive, in no doubt allowed, that something extraordinary, even if they couldn't make sense of it, even if they couldn't explain it, something extraordinary was happening with this young girl. But the key to this whole passage is she's deeply disturbed. She's utterly confused. She has now been, in some sense, handed At worst, a death sentence. She could have been stoned for her perceived behavior. At best, it's what we understand is why these stories are even here. That critics of Jesus, critics of the church, that there were rumors that circulated long after Jesus' birth, long after Jesus' resurrection, that Jesus was illegitimate, that Joseph's paternity was in doubt, that Mary was a bad girl with a bad reputation. Like so many people that ever get slandered, that have developed a bad reputation, some of you have had that happen to you. How easy is it to get rid of a bad reputation? How easy is it to overcome rumor and innuendo and the polite whispers of sometimes friends behind your back? That's the legacy of Mary. And so that's why when we look at God calling this young girl Holy Mary, the Blessed Mother of God, and the reason we need to use that language, remembering Mary as the Holy and Blessed Mother of God, is because we need to remember that the rehabilitation of a bad reputation is perpetual. Because the burden of Mary is the burden of so many other people. The blessing of God to Mary forever changed Mary and her reputation, and forever changed her heart. Mary received the gifts of the Magi, which included the gifts of myrrh, which was a spice for anointing a dead body. Mary knew that she gave birth to a child who was marked for death. And Mary, we're told in the Gospels, we hear the stories. Jesus is starting his ministry, and he's going around the Sea of Galilee region, and he's talking about the love of God, but he's also talking about himself as connected so indisputably to this God that he and God are inseparable, and it's causing rumors and it's causing scandal. And we hear at a couple of points where Jesus' mother with his Jesus' brothers and sisters are coming down to tell Jesus, you're ruining the family name. People are talking about you. You're embarrassing us. You're embarrassing yourself. And Mary, we're told in the end, is one of three Marys that didn't leave Jesus when everyone else did. When all of Jesus' apostles ran from the cross, Mary was there, watching her son die. The worst kind of death anyone could ever imagine. She was there. She saw how he was beaten. She saw how he was crucified. She saw his last breath. Sometimes the blessings of God are terrible burdens. Sometimes the blessings of God don't have a cute little training wheel to help ease how we carry the cross that God has given to us. When Mary, in the end, looks at this angel who has utterly changed not only her present but her future, when Mary turns to that angel and says, "Behold, your servant," she teaches all of us how to handle the burdens of God. When the burdens of God are actually a blessing. You see, here's what you and I don't know about the will of God. You and I don't know that sometimes the burdens that God has given to you are for the benefit of others. When all we listen to are voices that tell us that we're to expect our best life now, we get selfish and self-centered. We think that God exists for us and for our personal benefit and amusement. When the reality is sometimes God is using you and I not for your sake, but for His sake. Sometimes God gives you a burden, which is a terrible source of suffering for you, but it's a blessing for somebody else. That's why the humanity of Mary matters. Because when we see a girl, not a saint, not a holy figure, not someone elevated above, but somewhere stuck between heaven and earth, but when we see a young Palestinian girl being told that she's now going to suffer bad reputation, scandal, innuendo forever, that she's going to see her only son and embarrassment, when she's going to hear whispering not only about her but about her son, and when she's got to stand there witness to the last dying gasp of her son, then we can learn that as she says, "Behold, your servant," we learn that sometimes this is what the life of faith is all about. The challenge for you and I is precisely Mary's challenge. How do we turn a burden into a blessing? How do we turn suffering into purposefulness? How do we turn the challenges of the circumstances of our lives into, rather than seeing it as some unfortunate circumstance, but a way in God, some way in which God may not be blessing you, but may intend to bless somebody else? And when those days come, when those hard and horrible days come, do you and I have the strength of a 14-year-old girl? Do you and I have the faith of this young girl? In the midst of a horrific burden being dropped on her shoulders, she didn't pray for it, she didn't ask for it, she didn't expect it, it's just given to her. And she says, instead of, "Why? Why me? How dare I? I can't handle it. I'm not strong enough." Instead, she looks at this messenger of God, looks at him and says, "Here I am." I hope. I have not had that burden dropped on my shoulders yet. I don't know if that day will come. I pray it doesn't. But if that day ever does come, that's my prayer. That's where I have not been tested. Do I have the faith that at the moment God drops a horrific burden in my lap, no training wheels included, that I have the faith of a 14-year-old Palestinian girl who can look at her God in the midst of this horrific blessing that's been placed upon her and say, "Behold your servant." That's your challenge, and it's my challenge, and it's the challenge of Christmas. There's more to Christmas than a cute little baby born in a cute little manger somewhere far away. Amen. Our closing hymn